Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the ACS National Virtual Convention. I'm Jill Dash, the Vice President of Strategic Engagement at the American Constitution Society. I'm very excited to introduce our next program, Promoting Progress, Lawyering in the Biden-Harris Era. While many lawyers hope to, and indeed will, serve in the Biden-Harris administration, there are many careers that progressive lawyers can pursue outside the administration to protect our democracy and fight for more just and equitable laws. Our next panel will discuss the many exciting jobs that exist outside the administration for lawyers and how progressive lawyers can influence policy decisions. Moderating this panel is the fabulous Pollock, Public Policy Manager for Instagram. She previously served as Managing Director of the Affirmative Litigation Task Force in the San Francisco City Attorney's Office, and very notably, previously worked at the American Constitution Society because I had the very good sense to hire her. She was previously our Associate Director and then Deputy Director of Network Advancement. She is also a co-founder of the Post-March Salon, or PMS, a group of women that meets every month to inspire activism, education, and civic engagement. Pollock, take it away.
Thank you so much, Jill, and thank you, ACS, for this opportunity. I am so excited to be here with everyone today and introduce and moderate today's panel. As Jill mentioned, my name is Pollock. And I think for me, before we bring on our panelists, I just wanted to say that this topic in particular is one that's of huge interest to myself, and I'm sure to many of you, young lawyers, transitioning, or law students, because many of us are looking for how we can lead a career with progressive values. So with that, let me bring on the panelists to do quick introductions. And while they're joining us, I just want to add that, for those listening today, navigating a career that pushes forth progressive values, serves the public, has meaningful impact, all while keeping you intellectually challenged and growing, is a hard path to navigate. I know that I can speak to my own experience, having gone from direct legal services, serving the Asian Pacific Islander community out of law school, to, of course that happens right during this call, to transitioning to more of a policy programs role, to then joining ACS, to leaving there, to then join a municipal law office in San Francisco City Attorney's Office, leading our affirmative litigation task force, and then now to my current role in-house at Instagram and our public policy team, that all of these decisions that I made were led by the idea that I wanted to have meaningful impact in my career. So I'm so excited to welcome all of our panelists and have each of you spend a couple minutes introducing yourselves, your current role, and perhaps why what you're doing in that role. We'll start with you, Andrea.
Hi, thanks so much, Pollock. My name is Andrea Christian. I'm the Law and Policy Director at the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice. The Institute is based in the mighty city of Newark, New Jersey. We are a legal policy and advocacy organization that aims to develop reparative systems and structures for New Jersey's Black and Brown communities and other communities of color. Since I joined the Institute, I started as associate counsel, then elevated to director of our criminal justice reform body of work, and now I'm law and policy director, overseeing our three interconnected pillars: criminal justice, democracy and justice, and economic justice reform. I was a graduate of law school in 2013. After that, I clerked for a year in the Eastern District of Pennsylvania under then Chief Judge Patrice B. Tucker, before working at a law firm in New York City, Fried Frank, before coming to my current position. So I'm excited to talk with you all today about, if anyone's interested in the clerkship experience, interested in working in a firm and then transitioning to public interest sector, and then the work I'm doing at my current job, where some of our campaigns include a campaign for New Jersey to create a reparations task force, the closure of New Jersey's 3 youth prisons and reinvestment into community-based programs, and expanding the right to vote to incarcerated people, as well as same-day voting as well. So I'm same-day voting registration as well. So I'm very excited to be here, and thank you again.
Thank you, Andrea. Next, Jeffrey or Jeff.
Jeff. Yeah, Jeff Swan. Hi, folks. I'm Jeff Sprung. I'm currently an Assistant Attorney General for the state of Washington. And I thought I had a circuitous route to my current career, but Pollock, yours may match or overtake mine. But I started at a big law firm in Washington, D.C. And at what was then Hogan and Hartson, now Hogan Lovells. After staying there for about 4 years, I joined a political campaign, a presidential campaign. And when my candidate lost, unfortunately, I went to the U.S. Attorney's Office and worked there for about 4 years, and then moved out of D.C. and to Seattle, Washington, joined a plaintiffs' complex litigation and class action law firm. And from there, I was there for about 20 years as was a partner there, and then left there. And when Trump was elected, I had the opportunity to come work for our Attorney General to help in some of the litigation our state engaged in against the Trump administration. I have one quick thought I want to share with you all, which is when thinking, I've learned in the career choices I've made when thinking about what kind of work you want to do to credit your gut. I started at a big law firm, and I didn't really like being a lawyer all that much at that, unfortunately for me. And then when I went to the U.S. Attorney's Office, I was kind of handling some of the same or similar cases and found out that I, in fact, loved what I was doing. And it was because of the side that I was on. It worked for me to represent the little guy, or to go up against the bigger established powers. And so that's how I ended up in a career of pursuing progressive causes, representing the people who didn't have a voice, didn't have a seat at the table. And so I would urge you, if that's what your gut tells you, to pursue that. It's very satisfying.
Thank you, Jeff. I think next we have Esmeralda.
Good afternoon. Thanks for having me join this great panel. Esmeralda Rodriguez, a principal, co-founder of the Rabin Group, a government affairs firm here in DC. Been up to no good and mischief the last 16 years and have a good time doing that. Came out of law school straight into the Department of Housing and Urban Development under then Secretary Henry Cisneros, and then Mr. Cuomo, now governor there in New York. I also, as Jeff said, had a realization at some point that I did not like what I was doing as an attorney. It could very well have been because of the side I was on. I decided not to experiment and just left the legal practice altogether and went into the government affairs work and advocacy, similar to Jeff as well, on behalf of the little guy, fighting the good fight on a number of fronts, on immigration reform, climate issues, human rights, domestic violence issues, and over the course of the last 15 years, decided to volunteer my time and our team's time here at the Rabin Group, fighting for the creation of a National American Latino Museum on the National Mall, by following in the footsteps of the African American Museum, correcting American history as we see it on the National Mall, so that it is inclusive of the diversity of all of the origins of our nation and all sectors, lifting up impactful stories from the American Latino community across 500 years. A lot of fun doing that as we finally passed that legislation in December 2020 after 16 some years. Thank you. I put dibs on the water fountain, the lowest level of the museum. So you'll see my name there, hopefully, if we're still doing water fountains then. In any case, we've been having a good time here at the Rabin Group, exploring so many different areas of the progressive agenda. Happy to have this conversation to talk about how we can make a difference, working from all of the sides that drive and change policy, to impact our community. So thanks again for having me join you.
Thank you so much, Esmeralda. And then Camilla, last but definitely not least, please bring us home with introductions.
Well, thanks so much for having me. It's a thrill to be here. My name is Camilla Taylor, pronouns she, her, hers, and I'm currently the litigation director at Lambda Legal Defense and Education Fund, which is, as we say in our mission statement, the nation's oldest and largest civil rights organization that is dedicated to the advancement of the civil rights of lesbians, gay men, bisexuals, transgender people, and people living with HIV. And before I became litigation director, I did a bunch of different things here. But most recently, I was the marriage project director and did a lot of marriage work until we closed up shop after Obergefell versus Hodges in 2015, which struck down the remaining marriage bans nationwide. Before I came to Lambda Legal in 2002, ages ago, I was an appellate public defender with the Legal Aid Society in New York City. And I did that for about 5 years. And before that, I was a litigation associate at the law firm Sherman and Sterling, also in New York City. One of the things that I think might be good to keep in mind for folks thinking about transitioning to a public interest job is that a lot of us had to apply multiple times to get to the position that was our dream job. And in my case, I had to apply twice to be a Lambda Legal lawyer, but it was really my dream to do impact litigation, law reform litigation for a public interest organization. And so don't be embarrassed and keep at it, and you may get it.
Fantastic. I appreciate all of the candor, all of the windy paths, all of the seemingly frustrated experiences that then led to transitioning to another experience, and really just discovering what works for you. I know that we have limited time together, so I want to get right into today's questions. I asked my panelists keep their responses somewhat brief, which is not always easy for all of us lawyers or recovering lawyers. And then hopefully at the end, we'll have a little bit of time to take some live Q&A. So I'll just start right off the bat, given the name of today's program, with how your work differs under the current administration, the Biden-Harris administration, as from the previous administration. I know, Jeff, you mentioned that you actually left your plaintiff side law firm to go to the Attorney General's office specifically after Trump was elected. I'm curious how that decision now plays, how that's working out for you now that Biden and Harris, that we're under a Biden-Harris administration. So why don't we start with you, and then we'll ask Camilla the same question.
Great, thanks. Well, now fortunately, Pollock, I have a chance to breathe, so that's a good thing. It started out as the time would be a marathon, a 4-year run, but we were sprinting the entire time. And so the work that I did, it was tremendously gratifying. We stopped policies, sometimes with nationwide injunctions, in the immigration context, in the public charge, on the public charge rule. Our office led the multi-state litigation against the Trump administration that set that aside. And we also litigated Title X case, which women's reproductive health, some very important issues on that, and what was called a conscience-based rule that allowed healthcare providers to impose their personal belief in the care they provide. We were able to get that set aside nationwide. So that was all really exciting work. Now, of course, those policy issues, we've been fortunate enough to work with the Biden administration to set those aside, but there's still fantastic work that I'm able to do. So just to give one or two examples, we've had, as everyone knows, during the pandemic, all of the nation's unemployment offices across the state were raided essentially by identity thieves. And in Washington, we lost about $700 million. So have the fortune of leading a team that is seeking to recover that money. It's exciting work. It's a huge hole in many state budgets. So we're looking at creative theories to try to go after individuals, hold them responsible. for that. Also, I am looking at healthcare providers and religious hospitals, some religious hospitals in particular, and looking at how to make sure that information that women in particular get, but all patients get, is full, accurate information, whether there are legal theories that we can use to ensure that healthcare providers are obligated to provide full and accurate information to patients. So still doing really interesting stuff. That's what I'm working on.
That's incredible. And I think that's a really good perspective to keep, which is that sometimes, you know, the state and local government offices are really where we can have so much impact, not just against an antagonistic federal government, but also throughout, you know, to really serve the public on a local level is where you can have some meaningful impact. So thank you for that, Jeff.
That's right.
Camilla, I'd love to hear from you. You've been working on these issues for a very long time, but I imagine that they've changed over the course of that time.
Yes, absolutely. Well, Election Day in 2016 was a very bad day for us. And immediately after that, we started mapping out all of the regulatory and administrative advancements for the LGBT community that we'd managed to attain, you know, up until that date, because we anticipated that they would be attacked and probably disappear. And on Inauguration Day, the attack started, and we were pretty much under assault for 4 years under the Trump administration. And it was not just the LGBT community and people living with HIV, of course, but a lot of the attacks that we experienced were attacks against the most marginalized communities that were intersectional. And we found ourselves under attack, even in the same regulation, with gender affirming medical care being attacked, along with reproductive health care for anyone who needed to obtain it. And one of the things that ended up happening was we had wonderful collaborations with all sorts of impact litigation organizations, from the Center for Reproductive Rights to Americans United for Separation of Church and State to public entities. And it was the first time really that counties and cities came to us and said, we'd like to work with you. Can we be co-plaintiffs in the same case? Because we're all under attack right now, and this attack is ridiculous. And in many cases, we were talking about life or death situations. And if we didn't step in, the regulations that were being proposed and that the Trump administration tried to put into effect could really have resulted in very significant harms, if not deaths, to members of the public. We also had wonderful collaborations with state attorneys general, who were the tip of the spear, as many put it, in trying to push back against these attacks. And we owe the Washington Attorney General's office for a lot of things. We fought shoulder to shoulder with them against the ban on transgender military service, successfully getting an injunction for the duration that allowed current service members to continue to serve. And we also, in many cases, had coordinated efforts to stop the so-called conscience rule. We were very grateful for the injunction in Washington. We got one in the Northern District of California. There was another in New York with our sibling organizations playing a role. So there were many successes like that that prevented some of the worst impacts. However, there were still huge losses over the last 4 years for members of our community, and especially for Black and Brown members of our community. So we are in the process of trying to rebuild some of those gains. I think it's great now that many of those cases are cases where the Biden administration has asked for the case to be put on pause while it reconsiders its position, and we're optimistic about that. However, things were not perfect. Prior to Trump, we had cases against the federal government and discrimination in all sorts of different federal contexts, and I anticipate that we will continue to have such cases going forward. One of the cases in which we originally had a defendant named Secretary of State Kerry when we first filed it, and then transitioned it to Pompeo, and now Blinken, is a case seeking passports with non-binary gender markers, so that people who are non-binary can have accurate identity documents. We're also continuing to struggle against discrimination in federally funded government services, where government contractors are claiming a religious justification for refusing to serve members of the public with taxpayer funds. So there's still a lot of great work to do, but but it is nice that we no longer feel, especially on Friday evenings when many of the worst assaults would hit us, that we are not constantly under attack, and that in many contexts we actually have an ally.
I think so much of the work that you're referring to speaks to really just how cutting edge some of these progressive issues are that you're working on, that frankly are sometimes even more progressive or just have moved further along than where the federal government is. And so kind of keeping that thumb on the scale, keeping that pressure up to make sure that we're actually providing equity and non-discrimination to all of the communities, including the communities that you're working on behalf of, is something that will always be there, regardless of a friendly or foe administration. So thank you for that, and thank you for your work. Esmeralda, I want to turn to you because, being at the Raven Group, you're in the Lion's Den, you're in DC, you are surrounded by, who comes in and out of these administrations, and you're specifically working on government affairs and lobbying. So I'm really curious what it's like for you and how you work with a friendly administration as opposed to the opposite side.
Thanks. Yeah, it's a great question because I think a lot of folks that are not in the Beltway probably a little more disconnected from how the sausage is made in the Beltway. May not see the complexity here. I mean, we fight during elections. We want our candidates to win. Once they win, I think then most voters say, great, everything is going to be fixed. The reality is that elected official, that new administration inherits a lot of what the previous administration was doing. They have to then decide, what do we keep, what do we not keep? And then the allies from the outside scrutinizing the whole process have to decide, what are we going to drive home now that we've elected our chosen officials? What are we going to hold them accountable to? How do we prioritize that? And how groups or organizations are there to be that drumbeat, to demand quicker action on certain things than others? What are we willing to negotiate? How much time is that honeymoon period for this administration or any elected official? It's really complicated because there are certain things that you're going to immediately agree with the elected official or administration on, and you understand what the confirmation process might be to fill an agency and how slow that might be. But there are certain things that have been in the queue for too long. And there are certain things that we're absolutely not willing to wait for. And we're going to be hard on our friends. And that's not personal. That's just, you are very aware of the timetable. How long do we have the Senate for? How long do we have the House for? What's this grace period that we've got to work with? And as the administration or certain elected officials who we consider our friends and partners in this, as they juggle everything that they're doing, we have to hold them accountable. We have to remind them, we don't have a lot of time to wait. Just speaking bluntly, sometimes it's just bipartisanship is going to happen or it's not. We got to move forward. That's the debate everyone's having on infrastructure right now. What are we doing with that filibuster? What can the administration do on its own? I mean, we saw the previous administration and how much it loved executive orders. Is that another route that we're going? Lessons learned from the Obama years. It took forever to run that executive order through on Dreamers. And now we find ourselves again in a situation where we're looking at the immigration system not working. And it's easy to just point a finger at this administration and just say, fix it. It's a complicated problem. It doesn't mean we don't need a solution right now. So yes, we have to hold our friends accountable. Sometimes they'll be mad at us, but that's okay. That's the process. We'll be friendly on other issues, but we do have a clear agenda and we do have a timetable, and that's going to dictate how we run things, how we work together, and what they get mad at us about.
I love that answer so much because I think one of the things that you really highlight is fidelity to the issue. It's not about who's in the White House all the time. It's really about the issue that you're trying to resolve and fidelity to that issue, and working with people either on your side or across the aisle to make sure that you actually see some results. So I think that's helpful. I do want to move on because I know that so much of what we've talked about, well, at least what we just spoke about, was with regard to working with the federal government, but so much of progressive values and pushing forward progressive causes happens on the state and local level. I would be remiss if I didn't, mention my time at the San Francisco City Attorney's Office, which I think of as a laboratory for progressive change, as are many other local and state law offices. Andrea, let me ask you, because I think you have one of the most interesting kind of roles here, and your transition is one that I think a lot of people should learn a little bit about, which is in your current role, which is a policy role for a state, sort of a statewide organization. How are you pushing progressive values, especially more cutting edge ones? And how do you see the process perhaps being either easier, or you're seeing more success or more agility in your ability to do that on the state level?
Sure, and thanks so much for the question. So I think what we really saw over the past few years was fierce resistance at the federal level to the advancement of progressive policies. And so there was a real opening at the statewide level to have what we at the Institute call our from the ground up advocacy, where we were able to do things at the state level that maybe weren't able to be accomplished through policy at the federal level. And so at the Institute, our theory of change, we go to the community. What does the community need? What resources and supports do they need? We then write policy-driven research reports that look into the issue, that assess why the issue exists, and then create dynamic policy proposals to address the issue. We then turn those policy proposals into bills that we help advance through campaigns, and on the other side of passage, we work to implement it so that, as my colleague Retha says, people on the ground feel the change. And so we, using that theory of change, have been able to do a lot of great things at the state level. We recently were able to have the right to vote restored to 83,000 people on probation and parole in New Jersey, which is joining, as we're seeing across the nation, we're seeing that shift in a number of different states. We also worked with the city of Newark to do Newark 2020, a citywide initiative to match 2020 people who did not have employment to jobs within the city. And we were happy to be a partner with that. In addition, through our 150 Years is Enough campaign, which was aimed to close New Jersey's 3 youth prisons, we were able to get the closure announcement under former Governor Christie of 2 of New Jersey's 3 youth prisons. And so we were able to do a lot of this, both working with a wide, diverse coalition of partners at the state level, but also pulling in federal partners as needed to understand, okay, what's happening in other states and jurisdictions that we can also implement here. Our next big push is going to be around creating a New Jersey reparations task force. California got ahead of us on this one, but we're hoping that we could become the second state to implement such a task force. And with that, we're again pulling in our statewide diverse coalition of faith leaders, young people, advocates, retirees who are very interested in social justice and racial justice, as well as working with federal partners, because we know that obviously with HR 40 at the federal level, this is an issue that's gaining momentum both at the state and federal level. And so I think when people, think of New Jersey, they're not necessarily, okay, I'm clamoring to hop over there to do racial justice and social justice, but we actually released a document, which I think maybe I can drop in the chat, I'm not sure. It's the 2021 through 2022 agenda to make Black lives really matter in New Jersey. And what we did on the front cover of the document is we laid out all of the racial disparities that are present within New Jersey, where we have the worst Black to white youth incarceration and adult incarceration disparity rates in the nation. We have the worst Black to white infant mortality rate in the nation. We have one of the starkest racial wealth gaps in the nation, with a median, the white family median net wealth of $352,000 in New Jersey, the highest in America, but only $6,100 for Black families. And so New Jersey, places you might not think of, states you might not think of, have issues that need your attention just as much as national organizations that have obviously that national focus. And so I'll put a plug in here for looking to the states as real places where you can make progressive change.
That was incredible, and the information that you're providing, the data, the research that goes into actually getting those numbers on the statewide level are so incredible to making the issue more personal to people, right? Oftentimes we can kind of write off these issues as being probably something that's happening elsewhere, but that's exactly the type of information that we need more of, so that we can action on. So thank you, Andrea. I really appreciate that. I just want to take a moment before we go into the rest of the questions to let people know that they can drop in questions in the comments wherever you're watching this or streaming this from. You can drop in questions. I am looking at them. In about 15 minutes or so, we'll actually turn to these questions. So please feel free to. I think we'll be able to address at least all the ones that I've seen so far. Okay, so here's a little bit of a hot topic. I think for many of us progressive lawyers and law students, when we think about our career, we often think about it being in the public sector. We often think that to promote progressive values, we have to be in the public sector. But I know that all of you have, I believe all of you have spent some time in the private sector, and if not all, most of you. I would be curious if you could share how that experience either also promoted progressive values, or how it helped you move to your current role. And I'm happy to even just share that in my current role, which I think is not one that people think of as progressive lawyering whatsoever, what I like to look at is the consumer base. And I like to look at where are the trends going and who are impacted by what industries. When I was at the SF City Attorney's Office in the latter years of my time there, we also spent a good amount of time suing the Trump administration, getting a national injunction on our sanctuary cities, on his sanctuary city executive order, and things like that. And one of the things that I realized is that has incredible impact. But I was always going to be working on the level that was domestic, or it had some, it wasn't necessarily impacting billions of people a day. And that's partially why I was interested in changing sectors and helping steer from within. I'd love to hear first from you, Jeff, about your private sector experience and how your experience actually did lead to promoting progressive values.
Yeah, thanks, Pollock. I think that's a great question, one that is really near and dear to my heart, because I did spend 20 years in the private sector, and I think that we were able to do, the law firm I was at, was able to do a lot of good things in affecting public policy. But I guess I would draw this distinction. Well, let me start with this observation. I think the reason I think that being in the private sector can be a really important and powerful way to impact public policy is because what you can do in the private sector is you can have an impact on the financial, have a financial impact on companies. And we know if we look at what happened, for example, in Indiana, in Indianapolis, when the governor, I think it was Governor Pence at the time, was taking really terrible positions with regard to marriage equality, that there was an impact on the companies. And those companies, I thought, NCAA, I think holding the Sweet 16 or something there, those companies influence public policy.
Absolutely.
And we all know that a lot of public policy is driven by these, by the pressure we place on private companies that makes their situation uncomfortable or untenable. And that's what we got to do in the private sector. And so, it wasn't working, it wasn't drafting legislation or anything like that, but I brought whistleblower cases against companies, drug companies that were defrauding, Medicare beneficiaries. I brought price fixing cases against companies that existed in oligopolies, in industries where there are a few competitors. And there, I have a hard time pronouncing that. So there are opportunities, I think, in the private sector to impose costs on companies for policies that we all have a problem with. And when you go to a plaintiff side law firm, that's what you can do. You can spend your time doing that. And I spent 20 years doing that. And I think that some things we had a big impact on. Just one quick anecdote. We went to my son's high school graduation last night or the night before last.
Wow.
And it was at the Seattle Mariners Stadium. Like, it was to reward these kids for having slogged through during COVID. And I was so we were in the seats, and they had screens along the third base line and along the first base line that protected people from line drives, from getting hit. And I remember when I was in my law firm, and one of the lawyers brought a lawsuit against Major League Baseball for people getting beamed with these baseballs. And I thought to myself, boy, that's a crazy lawsuit. That's never going to amount to anything. And these screens are up at least at T-Mobile Park in Seattle. So you can have an impact.
I think, I think everyone can now credit lawyers for helping in that situation, which who knew? I think that that's a great perspective to keep, frankly. We not only is there the financial impact that these companies are hit by when plaintiff side law firms bring cases like the ones you're mentioning, or the benefit to the users that some of those, the recovery, but I also think there's reputational risk. And as we know now, companies are more and more, there's competition exists for a reason. And when you go after a company for doing something that isn't in the support of their users, the reputational risk that they take, they oftentimes also help steer behavior. So I think sometimes we just, each of us, if I think about what each of you have spoken about, so much of what it comes back to is the community you're serving, whether that's the Black and Brown criminal, the Black and Brown community through criminal justice reform, whether it's the LGBTQ community and the intersections of those communities, whether it's consumers and all the disadvantages that consumers are at with regard to these big companies. So thanks for that, Jeff. I think that's great perspective. And I know for myself, at least, we hired a lot at the San Francisco City Attorney's Office from folks that came from plaintiff side law firms for that exact reason. I would love to also ask Camilla, and if we have time, Andrea, about your experiences in the private sector and how you transitioned that to the public sector and why.
Sure. At my law firm, I was a litigation associate, so I had an opportunity to do some very meaningful pro bono work while I was there, and the law firm Sherman and Sterling generously supported it. We often hire from private law firms. In fact, we just hired a wonderful lawyer from a private law firm last week, who's a fourth-year associate, because often public interest organizations lack the resources to do a lot of the training that law firms do very vigorously, and we get very talented lawyers that way. I also think even if you are at a private law firm doing defense side litigation, there are many opportunities to do pro bono work hand in hand with impact litigation organizations. We would not have achieved a fraction of the successes that we have achieved, especially over the last 4 years, if it not been for the help of law firms like Kirkland and Ellis, which is, I understand, a sponsor of this conference. Kirkland and Ellis was the law firm that fought with us to get the transgender military ban struck down as unconstitutional. And that takes an enormous amount of work and discovery. We were aiming for a trial, just huge resources that an impact litigation nonprofit likely would not have. So there are many such opportunities. We rarely do a case on our own. Sometimes we do, but it's more often that we pair up with law firms, often defense side law firms, whose associates are very happy to get this sort of experience.
I appreciate that. And also, look, let's just keep it real. Law school is not cheap. So for those that have student loans, it is a clear opportunity for you to help repay those and make that money and also get that training. But I think what you just mentioned, Camilla, is a good point, which is that while you're sluggishly working in those law firms, I do think that it's important that you also are able to advocate for or participate in these pro bono efforts. So I think that's a great point. I'm actually going to move to the next question. Andrea, I'll let you decide whether or not you want to answer the previous one. But I actually think one thing that is not spoken about enough in law school is the range of non-lawyer, non-traditional legal jobs that you can use your law school training for. And so I would love to kind of take this opportunity to ask you and then Estuardo to talk a little bit about your path to work on policy and government affairs. How did you find yourself in this current role? What was that path? And for those that are interested in kind of navigating that, what would you recommend?
Sure. So I had wanted to be a prosecutor since I was assigned to be a prosecutor in 8th grade mock trial. And so had a very narrow focus when I entered law school, and then very early on realized I wanted nothing to do with prosecution. And so had kind of a crisis of conscience during my 1L year, kind of figuring out what I wanted to do in the law. At the time, firms were coming to recruit for their summer associate positions, and a firm came, Fried Frank, which had a fellowship where you would work for 2 years at the firm as a litigation associate and then would move on to the NAACP Legal Defense Fund to work there. And usually people stayed on after that. I had been president of my NAACP chapter, and so I said, oh, this sounds like a wonderful fit. And so I summered at Fried Frank so they would get to know me. I interned at LDF so they would know me as well. And I made it very far in the process, but didn't ultimately get the fellowship. And so again, had a pivot point where I had to kind of figure out my next steps. Since I thankfully did well during my summer associate position, I had the offer to come back after graduation to Fried Frank. And so after clerking for a year, as I mentioned, I went back to the firm. When I was ready, and I echo everything Camilla said, she couldn't have said it better about the training. I was a litigation associate at the firm. I got a lot of wonderful training and decided, okay, it's time for me to move on to the public sector. I really didn't even know policy was an option. That was not kind of in my thinking, but I reached out to Ryan Haygood, who had previously been the deputy director of litigation at LDF, who had since joined my current organization, and said, I have an opening here. That kind of brought me to the policy shop perspective. And so it was not a clear-cut path. I think I pivoted at least 3 or 4 times along the law school journey. But I think to your point, people should, as much as you can, remain open about what you might want to practice. Maybe you want to actually practice as a lawyer. Maybe you want to use your legal skills to practice a non-traditional job as well, but take the law school experience to try out different classes, to do clinics, which I can't stress enough. Do anything that you think will get you a wide breadth of experiences so you can make the most informed decision about what you want to do after graduation.
I think that, yeah, thank you. I really do think that more and more people need to hear that. Both the not knowing exactly what you want to do while in law school, while at the same time being around peers that know exactly what they want to do, realizing that networks like ACS are a perfect opportunity for you to learn and hear from what other like-minded lawyers are doing with their training. And also I think ultimately, like, opening yourself up to opportunities that you might not know anyone that does, but could actually fulfill your desires with your career. Estuardo, same question to you. I often do government affairs, and I remember even when I was looking for jobs, seeing it in so many different job postings, and thinking, what does this exactly mean?
What does this mean? That is a question. I'm going to actually piggyback off of what Andrea said. In exposing yourself to a number of things, that's the key. I'm first generation. My parents came here from Peru in the 60s. I went to college and then to law school because that was what I thought I needed to do. Being first generation, unfortunately, I didn't have that structure. Like, okay, first you need to organize all of your applications and look at all the areas of law that there is, and then you kind of methodically go about your 1L, 2L, 3L years. I just completely I winged the whole thing. I'm not gonna lie. I made it up as I went along, and because I didn't have that structure, I was surrounded by law students whose parents were lawyers or they were doctors, so they had some semblance of what that life was going to be about. And after about a year of trying to copy what they were doing in terms of study habits, realized that I had to find my own way and find my own community, find my own network to help me get through those years. From there, it was an experimentation. Do I get involved? My first job was Department of Housing and Urban Development in the Enforcement Division, exposing me to a specific side of government and policy that I did not like at all. It was highly bureaucratic and disconnected from actually helping people. It was actually the reverse. We did some work that ultimately didn't connect with people the way that I had wanted to, but it did give me the exposure to policy. And I realized from there that there was a different way to work on policy that was not from this agency side of suing different program participants or enforcing regulations. Which, let me tell you, there's a lot of regulations at the Department of Housing and Urban Development. But that aside, and for another panel, it did give me that opportunity to look at messaging. How do we talk about policy? How do we look at the communities that are impacted or affected by policy and explain to them why they should care about this? That piece really did excite me. And from there, I just kind of decided to volunteer, to jump on campaigns, to the dismay of my parents, having a lawyer in their house who made $25,000 in a year because I was volunteering so much. What a disappointment to the immigrant story, right? But that's what I decided to do, so I could at least get exposure to what really excited me. And I think that's a risk if you can take it. Depending on your situation economically, if you can take that risk, it's worth it, because having exposure to policy through jump on campaigns, and by campaigns, I mean political campaigns, as well as advocacy campaigns, it really gives you a different viewpoint of how elected officials really do rely on us from the outside to educate them, to remind them, what the impact is of what they're legislating, because this beltway, and I'm pointing like where I am, but the capital is that way. But this environment is a fishbowl, and people forget, what they're advocating for has a broader impact on a day-to-day basis. So that's what excited me. It ultimately led me to connect and build out my network in this advocacy, communications, media relations kind of world, because ultimately, how do you impact and how do you reach more people before Instagram came around? How do you reach people? You reach them through the media, making sure that wherever they're reading or getting their news, whatever's on their feed, you're educating those portals to better get access. That was the other piece that really excited me, was that we were driving these messages to get people to do something, to feel like they're part of this effort, which I think is also part of this conversation we're having here. How do we all remain active and not just sit back because, the Biden administration won, so we can finally get caught up on that Netflix series that we put off for the last 4 years, right? No, you can watch it, but there's still so much that needs to be done, because nothing should be taken for granted or as a done deal. We know what happened in the Obama years. So much that wasn't done because the power structure and the power dynamic back then. The situation is similar today, and that's why we need to make sure that we're still involved, regardless of whether you're in the administration, you're in the private sector or not. I want to answer other questions about the private sector, because it is amazing what we're witnessing over the last 10 to 15 years, the shift of the corporate culture to a values-driven. Not everyone, but many companies are now pushing them out of their comfort zone and taking a stand on certain values. That's an opportunity for us to maximize. And I think a lot of it is also driven by the fact that we have been, and I mean the collective, we have been talking about diversity within the C-suite, within the corporate board. We've been talking about diversifying all of those power structures within corporations for a long time, and they're starting to make that difference that we need, because if they're not diverse, then why would they understand, or how could they understand that they need to stand with their value? Let me stop myself.
I would actually love for you to continue. If we could extend this by 15 more minutes, that would be great. But I do want to be mindful of the questions that we've gotten in the chat. I also want to welcome more folks to send us questions. Esmeralda, I think everything that you were saying makes me realize and think about my current work, which is we are living in an era of misinformation. There's so much noise out there, and being able to be a lawyer and translate what different communities want to our legislators, translate the importance of what legislators are doing that serve their communities in a way that's clear, that makes the legal or legalese or even like policy wonky kind of subjects a little bit more understandable so that people can take advantage of the programs that are being made for them is such a huge skill that I think many of us have, but don't really know how we can use. And so government affairs, based on what you just shared, actually sounds like a really incredible pathway for people that are interested in that. Okay, so I know I received a couple of questions from the group. From people that are watching. If you have a question, please do chat or leave it in the chat. I'll start with the question from Lynn's Lang, and I imagine that that's your username, and maybe that is your full first name or first name, last name. But I'll ask this question to Camilla, and I think this was a great question, which is, for someone who wants to potentially be a judge someday, how would you recommend balancing that goal with engaging in advocacy efforts that could be seen as potentially controversial? This is near and dear to ACS's heart as well.
Well, I think that's an excellent question. And as someone who was always a very progressive public interest lawyer, I just kind of assumed that being a judge was not within my menu of options from the moment I decided that I was going to take a job at Lambda Legal. And that is no longer true. The Biden administration and the Senate are very focused on trying to make sure that there's now a menu of options among public defenders in particular and civil rights lawyers, voting rights lawyers, all sorts of social justice lawyers, environmental lawyers, people who were not traditionally represented in the menu of options considered by for Senate confirmation purposes. So you should certainly not think that it puts you off track. The world has changed, and civil rights lawyers are now being strongly considered for a number of different positions. I also think, too, that, of course, clerkships are highly valued. It's a great way to get to understand how the federal judiciary works. That's something I wish I had done, and I was so eager to get out there in the field and do progressive do-gooder work that I didn't do it, that if I could go back, I would do that now. And I also think too, and maybe this is a Gen X thing, that in my assumption that I was putting being a judge off of the realm of possibility simply by being a public interest lawyer, when I made that decision over 20 years ago, I wasn't as circumspect as I should have been on social media in retrospect. And that's also something to consider. I might not have said a few of the things that I said. That didn't matter at all for Trump.
Yeah. Well, it's very interesting. I remember years ago when both Judge Chabria was nominated, as well as I think Judge Chen, and the scrutiny of their work either at the ACLU or even at the San Francisco City Attorney's Office was very high. And I just think that we are kind of seeing the shift in some of the lawyers that were then baby lawyers are now in positions of being on these judicial nomination boards and seeking out different skills in judges. So I think that the guidance has changed. I think I'm really happy to hear from your perspective that you think it's changed. And I think we need to hold ourselves accountable too, to making sure that we're also looking for the right things when we're looking for judges. The other question that came from the chat is whether or not, and I just want to make sure I have the right question. What organizations are hiring for people interested in working on voting rights? Do any of the panelists have a good response to this? I know that there's a number of organizations that might not be singularly focused on voting rights that have either departments or positions, but I would love to hear from you all. Oh, and Andrea.
I would say it's not specifically voting rights, but it's within the election, democracy and justice area of law. We're actually hiring right now for an associate counsel for redistricting. New Jersey's about to enter the redistricting process, and it's going to be very interesting this year because obviously we got the census data late, which has thrown off our redistricting process a little bit. And so if you're interested, you can go to njisj.org and look up that position, because we're looking to hire as soon as possible. Would love to have anyone interested in the redistricting process on board.
If you are from New Jersey or you're interested in moving to New Jersey, there is a great resource and a great opportunity for you. So, and it sounds like they're doing great work. So, but if they're also, I'm always curious, like if there are kind of like sister organizations in other states, please share in the chat if people are aware of them. That would be great. And also for those that are in the audience, you will have an opportunity to also respond to this question about organizations that are potentially hiring for voting rights. So please don't be shy to do that.
If I could actually just interrupt real quick, just because I think it's an important question that has too many different answers to it that people should understand. One is, you care about voting rights, you're a lawyer, but you want to do more of the advocacy side, right? Just in comparison to what Andrea said, you could go work on redistricting, which is a very specific area, that's going to impact a lot of voters in the midterms and the next presidential. But advocacy is another important piece of that would really benefit from a lawyer's skill set. You could work for NAACP, you could work for Unidos US, you could work for ACLU. Right? There's so many different organizations right now looking at pushing forward specific voting rights bills that have not been. I mean, the Voting Rights Act has not been reauthorized in what seems like forever, and it used to be something that was just understood. You reauthorize the Voting Rights Act, and here we are, and we're in the Biden administration, and we still don't have that. So I would not narrow your scope, unless, of course, you know exactly the area of voting rights work you want to do. I would not narrow it down to just the going to court and defending voting rights kind of work. I mean, there's so many different aspects to this fight right now, and that could very well lead you to Capitol Hill and work for a member in the House or the Senate.
Thank you for that perspective. Very good point. And so we did just receive one question in the group, and then I'll end it, and I'll actually ask that question in tandem with the final question and ask all of our panelists to respond to either both, or at least the one that I'm asking you, fairly quickly so we can end on time. So the question from Rebecca Market is, for those of you working at national organizations, what are the chances that some legal jobs will be remote? I like the logistical, tactical question, because the reality is I think it's definitely a factor that people are going to be weighing when looking for jobs. And the question that I would love each of our panelists to answer is, what is the best and worst advice that you've gotten as you've made your career transitions? It will be hard to be brief, but if you can, that'd be great. Sorry, there are a few other, yeah, that's about it. Well, okay, go for it.
I'll jump in real quickly. First, to answer Pollock's question, I think maybe the worst advice I got was from the older generation, which was to be conservative and make sure I had a really secure job. And I think the best advice I've gotten is to take a risk, to take risks. I think that change is so healthy for all of us, and so everyone on this panel, I've been so impressed by the risks that they took to take new jobs where, perhaps the security wasn't as obvious, but I know I can say it ended up being, super gratifying to take the risk to, be free falling for a moment, but find out that there is something that there is a
safety net out there. Your legal training did provide some safety net to at least get a job. So yes, absolutely. Great. I won't call on each of you, but I do want to hear from each of you. Go ahead, Camilla.
First of all, on the voting rights question, and Eduardo mentioned a bunch of different great organizations, including ACLU and LDEF, which do great voting rights work. There's also the Brennan Center, Campaign Legal Center, and a number of other organizations. If you just look at the most recent SCOTUS voting rights cases and go down the captions, you'll see a lot of places to identify. With respect to remote work, yes, many organizations that previously would have required you to work with a particular physical office are now allowing those positions to be remote. That's certainly happening at Lambda Legal. That's happening in a lot of different organizations. Best and worst advice. I think Jeff's actually said it about the worst advice. Take risks, be fearless. That some of the best advice is about joining ACS and making sure that you have a network that you can call upon. And that's part of the reason why taking risks works out, because if I ever were interested in transitioning to a different type of job, I would call my pals that I've gotten to know over the years of ACS panels and interesting programming. And I'm sure that they would have really great suggestions for me. And it's also just a great community.
2 words, Jill Dash. If those of you who are listening, everyone in ACS should know who she is. She's absolutely the best person to talk to when you're looking for career transitions. I doubt that she's happy that I'm saying that, but she really is. Thank you so much.
And her personal phone number is?
Esmeralda, why don't you go next?
Yeah, I have a lot of great advice here. I think I'll quickly say the working from home thing, I think we all know we're not going to run back to the way life was before. I personally am grateful for that because my driving to DC is so much nicer than it used to be pre-pandemic. So I encourage you to continue the work from home, model. And the second thing, and I'll just only focus on the worst advice I got, and that was the worst advice I received on my career path was just to focus in on the one thing and to know exactly what I wanted to do and go get it, because I feel like that just restricted me. It made me feel like I was failing because I couldn't decide exactly what it was, and it limited me from just being organic in my process of understanding what else was out there. I think we all have those opportunities that surprise us in our career path. And sometimes the best, as they say in improv, always say yes, because that's the best way to go. You don't know where it might take you.
I love that. I couldn't agree more. Andrea?
Sure, and I'll just add in, I'm not at a national organization, so can't speak to that one, but I'll reframe the advice question, just say you're the best expert on yourself. And so people are going to have a lot of opinions, as people just said. If you need that money to pay off the student loans, if you send money home to your family, if you're a worker who can work solo, or if you can work on a team, if you can work in a high-paced environment, or you need something a little more slow. And so just trust yourself, try new things, but it's okay to move on to something else if it's not working, it doesn't fit where you are. And I will put in another plug for ACS. Our former Vice President, LaShawn Warren, was with ACS before, and so there's always connections through ACS. So it's a wonderful program, and I was so happy to be a part of it.
Thank you. And I'll just add 2 things, because I think this is an important question, and I found myself asking myself this a lot, which is the worst advice that I probably received is when someone simply asked me the question, where do you see yourself in 5 or 10 years? I think that's such a short-sighted question, ironically, because we are literally living at a time where we don't know what opportunities are going to exist in 5 to 10 years. We don't know what issues are going to arise in 5 to 10 years. So I wouldn't necessarily either ask that question, or when someone asks you that question, I would be a little bit more, I would be a little bit more honest about the fact that you don't know if you don't know. And in terms of the best advice I was given, I think it's just the attitude, in addition to what each of our panelists have shared. It is really just to allow yourself to remain a student while on your journey in your career. To have a growth mindset that you can always continue to learn in whatever role you're doing. And once you keep that mindset, you'll really approach any new job opportunity or any career opportunity as one where you will continue to grow and advance in your goals. So with that, I do want to say thank you so much to all of our panelists. You guys were incredible. We have everything here from policy, government affairs, impact litigators, statewide litigation. And I think that it really helps to hear all of these different perspectives on how you can push progressive lawyering deeply and perhaps more quickly and swiftly with more agility outside of a role in this current Biden-Harris administration, even for those of you that are gunning for it, which obviously many are. I also want to say, for those that are continuing in their ACS convention, that in an hour, ACS is hosting a virtual speed networking event starting at 6 p.m. Please plan to join to meet more of the amazing folks that are part of this network. I truly think that joining this network has long-term long-term benefits with your to accompany your legal career. The link to join is in your convention email. And if you have any trouble accessing the speed networking session, email acs@campus@acslaw.org. Just a fun anecdote. When I joined ACS, I worked on the inaugural, and I think actually was maybe my birth idea, the speed networking event, because I noticed that when you would attend an ACS convention as a young baby lawyer, there would always be these impressive people up on stage, and there are always the gunners that want to go and ask a question, and then there's the folks like me who don't feel very comfortable doing that. And so actually having an opportunity where you are forced to meet some of those people through a speed networking event was really, really beneficial. So there's that for inclusivity. Thank you everyone so much. And I'm just going to quickly go into the comments. Okay. Oh, hi, Chris. And thank you again, Estuardo, Jeff, Camilla, and Andrea.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. Great job.